So Kate is a researcher at SINTEF Ocean, specializing in using mixed methods to understand stakeholder perceptions of support for and interactions with ocean and coastal governance. She has worked with tribal members in the US, community members in the Pacific Islands, Norwegian fishers, Australian fisheries stakeholders, and international marine industry stakeholders, among others. She holds a master's in natural resources and environment from the University of Michigan and a PhD in public policy and management from the University of Washington. So without any further delay, I'll hand over to today's speaker. Kate, over to you.
So lovely introduction, sort of obviates the need for me to go through my very first slide. So today we're going to talk about sort of the big picture of science and sustainability and society. And as Chloe just shared, you know a little bit about my background, but first of all, and probably like many of you, I'm a lover of the ocean, right? That's where all of this comes from. I love the ocean and I want it to stay nice and for us to be able to use it. And in service of that sort of personal passion and desire, I currently work as a researcher at SINTEF Ocean. So in addition to sort of this work that Chloe shared with you about thinking about stakeholder perceptions and support and buy-in to ocean and coastal management, I also think a lot about the larger social structures within which conversations about marine and coastal management take place. I should warn you up front that this presentation is taken from a presentation that I gave at the Insight Structures in the Marine Environment conference. So a lot of the examples that I'm using here are going to be examples about the decommissioning of offshore structures, but the larger messages are really applicable to almost any context of marine and coastal management that you can think of. So it might seem like I'm focusing really on decommissioning because that was the context of the first time I gave this presentation, but I think the larger messages are much broader than that one context. So we as humans have been altering the marine and coastal environment for, centuries, millennia even. And we have done it both intentionally, as is the case here with this artificial reef designed to encourage coral growth in the Indo-Pacific, and unintentionally, as is the case with this shipwreck. Now, admittedly, this shipwreck is actually in the Great Lakes, not in the oceans, but it just happened to be the best picture that I could find. As I say, this is nothing new. We have been altering coasts and oceans for millennia. So here you see on the left, traditional Hawaiian fish ponds. So this was a method of sort of trapping small fish and keeping them to become larger fish so that they would be very easy to harvest along the coastline. And on the right, you see a Coast Salish clam garden, and that is another sort of aquaculture traditional practice that was in the Pacific Northwest of the US and Canada in the shallow intertidal. All of this is to say we keep changing the oceans and coasts. And that means that whatever our existing baselines are, they are shifted and they continue to shift. The human footprint on our oceans and coasts is simply irreversible. It is not possible to return to some mythical status quo where humans have not and do not influence oceans and coasts. And if you'll forgive my predilection for a terrible pun, that ship has sailed. So what does that mean? Well, it means that we can really only choose how we move forward. And here, all of us sitting in this call today, we have a really important role to play in making those choices about how to move forward. And that is really the heart of what I would like to talk about today. But we are not without guidance. So In fact, there are so many high-level frameworks and global and regional agreements and shared initiatives that frame the future oceans that we have as a global society decided that we want to move towards. So like me, and probably like most of you, the global community really cares about sustainable use of the oceans. At least that's what we say. We wish to continue to derive benefits from the oceans while minimizing the costs. So these statements and agreements, the European Ocean Pact, the OSPAR Agreement, the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, the Sustainable Development Goals, and on and on and on, the Decade of Ocean Science. They share a few commonalities beyond just this idea of, oh, we commit to sustainable use. They share a focus on decision-making that is grounded in science. So exactly the work that JNCC does, scientific advice should inform decision-making. And an understanding of sustainability that includes all three pillars of what we think of as sustainability. And that's not just environmental, but also economic and social sustainability. And lastly, because the framing of sustainability includes social sustainability, there is an explicit commitment in most of these agreements to social equity, some kind of fairness in costs and benefits and their distribution, and voice and power, and so on and so forth. These are beautiful ideas, right? We absolutely, they speak to exactly the kind of ocean and the kind of ocean use that I would like to see. And yet, it doesn't always feel as though we're making progress towards these goals. So there are a lot of reasons for this. Actively choosing sustainability is difficult because the systems that structure decision-making create and are subject to their own constraints, incentives, and rules. So what does that mean? Well, what that means is that decisions aren't just made based on scientific advice. Decisions are made in the face of power dynamics, political considerations, money, institutions, information, and narratives. So we are living in a time in which economic and political power and control of information are concentrated, and in which many power holders really benefit from keeping things the way they are, from business as usual, from less than sustainable choices. And even for those power holders or elected officials or whoever you wish to think about, even for those who really do wish to commit to sustainability, political and economic realities can preclude radical action. So it can be too expensive to completely transform your production. It can be, if you make sustainable choices that cost your constituents more money in taxes, they can immediately vote you out, or given the opportunity, immediately vote you out. Furthermore, the very institutions that we rely on to structure decision-making, our parliaments, our advisory bodies, etc., are built to resist change. And this is on purpose. So I have a PhD in public policy and governance, and in the study of public policy, we say that institutions are sticky. And what that means is that policy regimes are embedded in social structures. Some of these social structures are very obvious, our economic system, and some are less obvious, like our class systems or our sort of social hierarchies. Furthermore, bureaucracies are slow moving. Now, together, these things provide stability. So we don't necessarily have really sudden change, but the sort of flip side of the coin is that that stability also challenges efforts to systematically create widespread, lasting change. Lastly, we have access to more information than probably ever before. But we navigate these information ecosystems that are rife with uncertainty. And they include conflicting information that is shared in good faith, as well as outright bad actors who are actively seeking to manipulate narratives and understanding to achieve their own ends. And narratives really matter to how we perceive the world. The stories we tell shape the decisions we make. That means that terminology also matters. So in the context of decommissioning of offshore structures, think, for instance, about the difference between calling it biofouling or calling it an artificial reef effect, sounds so much nicer than biofouling, versus habitat creation for marine invasive species, right? Really the same thing, or at least the same basic phenomenon, but very different narratives incorporated in each of those terms. So again, control of narratives reinforces power. So it's probably not that surprising that sometimes we get stuck. So we have these systems that challenge our ability to make change, and we can all recognize that. But even beyond those systems, our own approaches to contention can challenge change. Sometimes contention can result in forward movement, and sometimes it just ends in stalemate. So I would like to talk to you now about the difference between positions and values. So positions tend to be intransigent. The position is that there is only one right solution. The only correct solution to declining fish populations is to increase the number of marine protected areas. That is a position. You can't, that's what I think. You cannot argue me out of it, right? In the context of decommissioning, we have a really great example of this in the Brent Spar case. If you're familiar with the Brent Spar case, Greenpeace took a hard line that the only correct solution to decommissioning this offshore facility was to completely remove it and dispose of it onshore. And they were very successful in how they framed the narrative and how they shared information and how they activated the power of public opinion. And they had this extremely long-lived effect on how decommissioning takes place in the North Sea to this day. The reason that OSPAR says, as it does to this day, that structures in the North Sea at their end of life must be completely removed in almost all cases is directly traceable back to Greenpeace's arguments in the Brent Spar case. This is a position. There was no other right answer as far as Greenpeace was concerned. So positions can seem extremely obvious if you hold that position, and they can be absolutely infuriating if you see things differently. Furthermore, if you have a position and I have a position, they're usually irreconcilable. You believe one thing, I believe something else. There is no meeting in the middle. Values, on the other hand, are what we really actually care about. They are behind and underneath the positions that we take. So when we discuss or even contend over values, we very often uncover common ground. So, it seems very safe to me to assume that Greenpeace's position, this hardline position in the Brent Spar case, was driven by pro-environmental values, a desire for clean, healthy oceans, and the need to protect marine ecosystems from harm. And those values are values that probably most of the people in that conversation shared to one extent or another. But we did not have that conversation around values, we had that conversation around positions. Confusing positions with values can leave us stuck when actually forward movement is possible. So again, contention over values tends to be constructive, or at least has the possibility, the potential to be constructive. And contention over position tends not to be. We become entrenched in our positions. So in the study of public policy and governance, there's a school of thought that argues that contention over public values is in fact necessary in a democratic society for that society to respond to the needs of its members. So as a society, we need to decide how we are going to progress. We have to know then what we care about. Progress towards what? Making more money? For so many years, that's been what we consider progress, and the only thing really that we consider progress, right? And in the last however many decades, we have started to realize, oh, there are other things also that we care about. So progress now not just towards making money, but towards the UN SDGs, for example. There's a famous German philosopher named Jürgen Habermas who coined this term, the public sphere. The public sphere means fora in which people can come together inclusively to criticize and identify problems and discuss, debate, and ideally reach a common understanding and some consensus on what matters and what needs to be done to achieve societal progress. Now, in the model of the public sphere, these conversations are reflected to the state, which acts accordingly. So simply in this model, we as a society talk to each other and we decide what we care about, and the state acts to realize those values. So in Habermas's time, the public sphere was coffee houses for Jürgen Habermas. In our time, people who study the public sphere study things like internet comment boards or Reddit or letters to the editor or even protest marches, the Extinction Rebellion events. So it's not difficult to immediately identify the limitations of each of those in terms of the ideal of a public sphere, which is this forum in which, this inclusive forum in which we can identify and discuss and debate and reach a common understanding, right? So not hard to see that some of what we now study as the public sphere is not exactly perfectly aligned with what Habermas was talking about. And a lot of that is because both the conversations and the decisions are mediated by that laundry list of things that I went through before: power, money, control of information, political realities, etc. So nonetheless, we do have this shared baseline that seems to be some kind of social agreement on the ocean that we want to see. This is public initiatives, it's agendas, it's agreements. They all reflect a shared specific set of values. Resource use is necessary, and it should be environmentally, economically, and socially sustainable. Decisions should be based on science, and equity matters. So from this shared baseline, we can measure progress, because these public values that we agree on form the basis for the things that we measure to see if we are reaching our goals. And of course, not just the things we care about, but also what we measure are subject to trade-offs, and what we value and what we measure change with context. So across marine and coastal management, we see contention over economic values. So that would be tensions between the desire for profit and growth and our desire for sustainable resource use or degrowth or incorporation of drivers other than profit. With ecological values, we see tension between anthropocentric, there it is, stances. These see humans as dominant over and holding a privileged place in the ecosystem, and ecocentrism, which sees humans as embedded in and dependent on broader ecological networks. And In the social sphere, we see tensions between, for instance, a desire to honor and preserve history and culture, and a desire to innovate and adapt and create the new. So let's go through quickly the example of decommissioning and look at what do we measure to support conversations about values and trade-offs and decision-making. So in decommissioning with economic values, we would look at what are the costs? What are the economic costs of decommissioning and how do they vary between different approaches? We would include the sort of life cycle approach where we'd look at the economic value also of reclaimed and recycled materials. And we would look at what we can do if we leave that thing in place. So this example is, I think it's in Indonesia. It's certainly down in the Pacific somewhere. And it is an oil rig that has been turned into a dive shop, a scuba diving shop. So quite creative, very different to the way we do it in Europe. With ecological values, we could look at reef effects, or if you prefer to call it biofouling, you can call it biofouling. So that could be reef effects in terms of endangered species or invasive species. It could be reef effects in terms of habitat creation for like a larger species complex, right? We would look at the effects of disturbance from removal and whatever ecological costs are incurred by decommissioning in place. For instance, if anti-fouling paint continues to leach into the environment. And in social values, we would look at how these structures interact with culturally important activities, like also maybe view sheds or fishing access or increased access to fishing for recreation, which is what happens in the Gulf of Mexico in the US. So this is all very well and good. And I know that the group that I'm speaking to here, you are mostly a bunch of scientists. And so the question then is, what about science? After all, this is all very well and good, values, we should all talk about it, we should all decide as a society. But the thing is that as scientists, we know the right answer. We know what to do, right? I hope you catch the sarcasm there because we're answering two different questions, right? When we say we know what to do, what we mean is, given a particular value, if you tell me where you want to go, I can help you figure out the right way to get there. It is not, I argue, science's job to decide where to go, or at least not science's job alone. Science can inform contention and explore trade-offs and provide guidance on what is necessary to achieve desired outcomes. But we are so frustrated so much of the time as scientists because it does not settle the debate or influence decision-making as much as we think it should. And the reason for that is not just because of power and money and politics and all of that, although of course, those are massively important. It is also because the technically optimal solution is not always the correct solution, because the correct solution depends on what we as a society care about. Science is embedded in society. We do not stand outside with some omniscient lens that says, like, let me tell you how you run your world. I mean, I do think I do this sometimes when I'm laying awake at night. I sort of believe this about myself, but in my saner, more wakeful moments, I know I am not omniscient. I do not stand outside the world. I would never want the job of organizing everything. It just doesn't work that way. Science is at best a partial, low-resolution reflection of part of reality. Science also has its own animating value systems that we import into our work. Science is positivistic, it's reductionist, it's materialistic. If you've ever worked with any indigenous population, the entire way of structuring and understanding knowledge is completely different. So if we only bring our scientific lens in, we are completely negating these other ways of understanding and knowing that have also been successful and, continued on despite multiple challenges for millennia. Furthermore, as scientists, we're people, right? And all people have biases. And we're not always fully aware of these, and they can shape not just the findings that we get, and hopefully they don't because we have good training for that. They can shape the questions that we ask, and that creates narratives, and narratives have power. So we come back to values again. I took you all the way around because it's not just a matter of better specifying the study or of doing the math, because there are all of these different dimensions and trade-offs that we need to evaluate. The gains and losses are incommensurate. So we can come up with new methods to measure and compare trade-offs. We can change everything into currency, right? We can value everything according to currency, but that comes with its own problems. There are things that are not directly valuable in economic terms that are deeply valuable in other terms. So all of the methods to measure and compare trade-offs are rife with their own issues. And ultimately, the correct answers come down to what we as a society or a community or a nation or a group of nations, what we value and what we are willing to trade to get what we value. So where does that leave us as scientists? Our role is 100% crucial. And this is what JNCC does, to my understanding. Provide the science upon which decisions can be based. But we need to remind ourselves that it is not our job to make the decisions. It is our job to support decision making. And it's not our job to settle contention over values, because we live in a society in which we have to all agree on our shared values and where we want to go together. What does that look like in practice? Well, consideration of economic and environmental values is very often institutionalized by regulatory requirements or by incentive structures of industry, for instance. These can be that could be things like the requirement to do an EIA, right? Or the requirement to, if you're going to destroy some wetland, you have to create or enhance some wetland somewhere else. These are institutionally structured rules that we can really understand better through science. I argue, as someone who studies much more the social value side of things, that social values are much less institutionalized. They are squashy. People think they're hand-wavy. They are more challenging to measure. They are strongly less generalizable. So social values in one place and social values somewhere else are likely to be completely different. And they're not always tractable to quantification. So science may be useful in the realm of social values to improve understanding, but the involvement of these values and trade-offs and these hyper-local differences mean that scientists also need to respond to stakeholder needs. And here's where I give you my little bit of cheerleading for stakeholder engagement. So I don't know to what extent you all are involved in EU projects, for instance, but in EU projects, we have this massive component of stakeholder engagement, right? And we pay a lot of lip service to stakeholder engagement, but what does that actually mean, right? So to the extent that we as scientists hope to just go away and do our science and then come to the correct solution to the problem we've identified and then tell decision makers, and then they do what we tell them to do, but they won't, they'll do something else, and then we will bemoan their unwillingness to follow our advice. That cycle does all of us a massive disservice. For science to contribute to the work of supporting decision-making for a sustainable society, stakeholder engagement needs to be at its heart. And here I mean stakeholder engagement, not just in terms of, well, we told the stakeholders what we were doing. We identified the problem for them, and then we told them how to solve it. It has to be about more than just, we just want them to understand what we're doing because then they will support us. There's certainly a place for that kind of work, but when we get to the realm of values, stakeholder engagement needs to be about co-creating, true co-creation of work that supports decisions that align with societal priorities. This is about not just, you know, stakeholder boards advising us. This is about going to stakeholders and saying, how do you see the problem? What do you think the problem is? This is about then working cooperatively with stakeholders to, after we identify the problem, identify the questions that we really want answered, and then co-create the path forward. And I would like to, again, my little cheerleading here, suggest that we as scientists also really need to embrace our roles. We are not just scientists, we are also members of the public. We are passionate about the things that we do. And that means that we have expertise and maybe capacity to engage in the public sphere, bringing our knowledge and our expertise and from the values that we hold. And in that public sphere, we can, as members of society, create a sustainable future for our society. We can take active part in that. So as we do that, we should remember that we will be of most service if we avoid locking ourselves into positions and we speak from our values. So that is what I have to share with you today. I think that was just about 30 minutes on the nose. My final words to you is that what I aspire to is to be humble and engage in cooperative learning and doing in service of a sustainable society. And I hope you'll join me. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Kate. That was an amazing talk. I kind of struggled to position my work in that kind of context. So that was actually, and I know that some of my colleagues do as well. So yeah, thank you. That was very interesting. We've got a few questions coming in on the Slido. If anybody in the audience wants to ask any questions, the Slido link is in the chat for this meeting. So please submit your questions in the next sort of 5 to 10 minutes. So I will just go through in order that they came in. Somebody says, I would argue that in negotiations, it is positions that change, not values, as it is the values that lead to the positions that we need to negotiate.
So that's an interesting point. And I think that in formal negotiations, that is true, right? I think that, for instance, when you have formal negotiations, like, I mean, maybe we don't get too political, but I can imagine that there are some formal negotiations currently going on where different parties have taken different positions that are mutually exclusive, and somebody's going to have to change their position, right? For sure. That is a win-lose proposition. Somebody's going to win and somebody's going to lose. And geopolitics left aside, in which that win-lose proposition is probably the only way, like these are power struggles, that's all they are, right? There's no shared value there, because the value is we want power, no, we want power, right? So to the extent that there are conversations where there are those underlying shared values, we want security in Europe, for instance, right? Then that is arguably a more fruitful conversation to have than the conversation about negotiations and positions, and somebody has to lose.
I don't think it will surprise anyone that it was James who answered that question. So James, would you like to respond?
Say, can I come in on that, please? It won't surprise you at all that it was me that asked that point.
No.
I can see where you're coming from in terms of where you've got people who've got very fixed positions. But I think that in many cases, certainly in most of the negotiations that I'm involved in, and for your benefit, Kate, I should say I'm the UK Scientific Councillor for the Convention on Migratory Species, and I've been involved in various and sundry with CITES and CPD as well. What you're actually looking for is a consensus that people can live with. And if you've got a position where everybody is a little unhappy, you've probably got some sort of sweet spot rather than somebody is happy and somebody is unhappy, because that is a win-lose proposition and that is not a good negotiation. I think where you get to some of the gnarlier subjects, and you're basically looking at the Ukraine-Russia example in your example there, that is very, very much more difficult, and that is why wars get fought. But I think for most of what we deal with, certainly at JNCC, what we're looking for is how can we bring the information that we've got to bear such that we can influence that decision in a way that we feel is going to be giving a good answer, if not the right answer. But certainly in a lot of the negotiations I've taken part in the CMS world, you quite often have an NGO with a very fixed view of what I want to achieve, which does not take account of those wider societal or wider policy requirements. And that is why you end up with the words that have been put forward being edited, because effectively, for most of these cases, CITES is a little bit different because they vote very often, but in most of these cases, it's actually about trying to find consensus. And certainly blocking consensus is seen as something that you shouldn't be doing unless you really, really, really mean it. And that's why we use red lines, but actually, in many cases, they're rather pink.
Yeah, I think I follow you, James, and I think that the context that you're speaking in, like, that's how the game is played, right? That's how the game of negotiation is played, is my understanding, is, you know, we come in with our positions and there's no room in that game to sort of come back down, right? Although I would argue that if you could, like, hypothetically, go to that NGO and say, I know you think it has to be this, but what is it that you're actually trying to achieve? What is it that you actually care about? There might be a fruitful conversation to be had.
There often is. There often is, and we often do. And I'll just give you an example, which is, I think it was CMS COP12 in Manila. I ended up having a conversation with our lawyer because she'd just come out of a contact group meeting where we had an NGO who was getting very upset about nets and wanting to ban the sale of all nets. And the problem with that was it's not the sale of the nets per se, it's the use of the nets for illegal capture and kill that was the problem. We actually need mist nets to be sold because they're the basic way in which we gain information on where birds have actually traveled to and from. So it's a basic understanding of science to be able to get the information that without which we would not be able to come up with good management actions. So the issue was around how do you try to make sure that you are tackling the bad part of what is going on, but also retaining the maneuverability and the flexibility to keep the good part.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that that's a perfect example of someone coming in with a position and then, you know, you underneath that, what is it that you really care about? And can we work towards what you really care about instead of just meeting you at that hard line? It has to be like this.
Yeah, very often.
Mm-hmm.
But that's why I say I think it's often about the values. So the reason why those positions are being taken are because of people's values,
100%,
rather than necessarily it's the position per se that is the thing that they are holding on to.
Completely agree. Completely agree. So you just have to dig down a little bit underneath the position to get to the values.
Yeah. Right, sorry, Tree, I'll let you ask the other questions.
That's very interesting. Thank you both. Next question is, do you think that it is viable to align economic and environmental goals in terms of the sustainable use of marine resources?
Speaking 100% on my own behalf, I think that and in no other capacity, I think that our current economic system is inherently incompatible with sustainability writ large. I think we have some real work to do to redefine how we understand success beyond just economic success and infinite growth and so on and so forth, to be able to create a truly sustainable future.
That's a depressing but not
Sorry.
entirely entirely viable answer. The next question might actually feed into that, which is, what practices have you found most effective for getting data, ecology and social scientists to collaborate meaningfully on shared ocean projects?
Oh, that's such a good question. I like that one. Yeah, so I have worked interdisciplinarily my entire career. I'm doing it now. It's hard, right? It's hard to do more than pay lip service. And I think that I probably have about, an hour's worth of answers to that question, but I think there's a number of things. I think that the personal relationships are incredibly important, right? We tend to, at least some of us who have really high level expert training, we tend to really privilege our own way of understanding the world, and it can be really difficult to meet other sort of domains of knowledge or ways of understanding, or understanding of what constitutes data, where they are, and understand and sort of engage with that. And that means that it is both about your sort of personal orientation and how open are you and how willing are you to really listen, but then it's also about this relationship building, right? I can't tell you how many scientists who are not social scientists I have worked with who over the course of a year or a couple of years have really been like, oh, actually, that's very interesting what you do. And now I see the value of it, who started out not understanding that. So I think it's those continued conversations, that willingness to engage. I also think that it's very important to build a common vocabulary. So we use jargon, all of us. And
acronyms.
That means, yeah, right? So it means you can't be afraid to be the one in the room who says, I don't know what that means. I don't know what it means when you say institutions. What does that mean, right? Or I don't know what that means when you say, I can't think of a good example, but I do it all the time, right? When a modeler starts talking to me, I'm like, I don't know what that means. It also means, however, that we have to check our own language and make sure that we're speaking really accessibly. And then I guess the other thing is put yourself in an environment where you have to do it. Because if you have to do it, you have to figure it out, right?
Yeah. And you'd hope, I guess, in that context that everybody has ultimately the same goals, or at least similar goals in mind. So it's a question of how you work together towards that, isn't it?
And it's actually, not a bad example of like an opportunity to somebody comes in and says like, no, the only thing that constitutes data, it has to be numbers. Only numbers are data, right? And now you say that to me and I see red, right? So that's then is like, well, what do you value about data, right? Why does it have to be numbers? And that's actually this an opportunity to have this conversation about like, where is our common ground, right? What is it? What do we all actually care about? What are we trying to accomplish? What can you contribute? What can I contribute? What can I give? What can you give, etc.
Yes. Next question is, given your research on trust, what are the best ways for scientists to build trust with communities impacted by ocean or coastal management decisions?
Yeah, that's another really great question. Just listen to them, right? I recently ran a survey of Norwegian fishermen, and I asked a lot about trust. And one of the things that came up over and over again in the open-ended answers was, they just don't listen to us. They don't care what we have to say, right? And that's a good reason to not trust somebody if you feel like they're not listening to you. So listen to them, take them seriously. Don't, no scientist is going to go out and intentionally condescend to stakeholders, but I would push it much further than that. And I would say these people are experts, the same way that you're an expert. It's a different kind of expertise, and it's a different pathway to expertise. But even a homeowner on the coast, they are an expert on that little tract of coastline where they live. Fishermen, they're out on the water all the time. They're for sure experts, right? So engage with them at that level of respect that you would give to another expert. Listen to them, ask them what their perceptions are, what their sort of issues are, what are the problems they see, and then respond to those and keep engaging. Don't go and ask them once and never go back. Keep engaging. Trust is relational, and it builds over time.
Excellent, thank you. And what is the most persistent barrier you've experienced when trying to integrate natural science and social science in your research?
So it's the quant-qual debate, right? So, and that is specifically, I'm thinking about that specifically because there are certain kinds of tools where we just do not have good methods for integrating qualitative information other than just turning it into quantitative information, right? So I'm thinking about, for instance, we work a lot in SINTEF with digital twins and developing digital twins, right? And if you're going to have some kind of input into a digital twin, at some point, you're going to have to turn your words into numbers so that it can be fed into the models that run the digital twin. And that, as somebody who works a lot with qualitative data, is just inherently problematic to me because we lose so much of the richness of qualitative data when we turn it into numbers. So I think that that is for me, that is the big sticking point. Otherwise, it shouldn't be, I mean, it is hard, right? But if you keep doing it and you approach it really, both sides approach it from this good faith sort of stance, collaborating. I love collaborating with natural scientists. I love it. It's so interesting. We get so much more done and it's so much more applied and useful.
Excellent. That is actually the last of the questions that we have come in today. So it looks like we're going to finish bang on time, which is perfect. Thank you so much for that talk. It was incredibly interesting and really gave me and hopefully everyone else an awful lot to think about in terms of how we conduct our work and how we make collaborations with other people. So thank you. That was really, really excellent.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really delighted to have been invited. Thanks, everyone.
You are welcome. Thank you. Goodbye, everyone.